Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline Lawyer, and this is another episode in our series discussing implementation of the agency law revisions effective January 1st, 2024. And in this episode, I want to talk about how you're going to draft the purchase and sale agreement to document seller's obligation to pay buyer broker compensation at closing. There are a few bright line rules. Number one, you use Form 21, paragraph 17, to document seller's offer of compensation. What has seller offered in the listing printout as compensation payable to buyer broker? X%, flat fee, whatever it might be. What is the amount that seller has offered? Form 21, paragraph 17 has nothing whatsoever to do with the amount of compensation a buyer broker might be owed. Form 21, paragraph 17 looks at one issue and one issue alone, and that question is, what amount of compensation has seller offered to buyer broker in the listing printout? That is the number that gets written into that blank space. If it's 0, then you write 0. If it's X%, you write X%. If it's a flat fee, you write whatever that dollar value might be. That represents seller's offer of compensation to a buyer broker, negotiated as part of the purchase and sale agreement between buyer and seller. Think about the context of this document. Form 21 is the purchase and sale agreement between the buyer and seller. So in that document, we set forth the offer of compensation that the seller has made to pay to buyer broker on buyer's behalf. And so also within that same provision, seller has offered the compensation. What's going to happen to that offer? Buyer is either going to accept that offer or counter that offer. If buyer accepts that offer of compensation from seller, then buyer broker, you represent that acceptance of seller's offer of compensation by marking the box that says pay as offered. And now buyer has accepted seller's offer of compensation. And you're going to do that any time the offer of compensation from seller is all that's required from seller at the closing table. If, however, seller's offer of compensation in the listing printout is different from what the buyer wants or needs the seller to pay at closing, then you have to negotiate the amount of compensation seller's actually going to pay at closing. And the only place you have that negotiation is on Form 41C. You do not negotiate the amount of compensation that the seller is going to bring to the closing table on Form 21 in paragraph 17. That is simply a disclosure of the amount the seller's offered. You do not ever negotiate the amount of compensation seller is going to pay towards buyer broker's compensation on Form 22A. Form 22A is the financing contingency. And in paragraph 3, buyer may ask seller to pay some or all of buyer's closing costs. And if so, great. Then you use Form 22A, paragraph 3 for that limited purpose. Seller, will you pay buyer's traditional closing costs? But you never, ever include in that provision a request for seller to pay buyer broker's compensation. If your buyer wants seller to pay some or all of buyer broker's compensation more than seller offered to pay, then you disclose on Form 21, paragraph 17, the amount that seller has offered, and you mark the box Other C Addendum. And then you go to Form 41C. The addendum that you've referenced by marking that provision is most likely going to be Form 41C. And in that scenario where seller has offered an inadequate amount to cover the compensation obligation that buyer already owes to the buyer agent based on the buyer agency agreement, in that scenario, once you get to Form 41C, you're going to mark either box 1 or box 2. And then you're going to fill in those provisions in order to request that seller bring additional compensation to the closing table. In a scenario where seller has offered more compensation than the amount that the buyer broker is going to take home at the closing table based on the existing obligation between buyer and buyer broker, in that scenario, you're going to fill in Form 21, paragraph 17 to disclose the amount of compensation that seller has offered, and you're going to mark the box that says Other C Addendum. And in a scenario where seller's offered more compensation than buyer broker is going to receive, then you're going to use either paragraph 3 or 4 on Form 41C. The third checkbox provision gives the extra back for the benefit of the buyer. The fourth provision gives the extra back to the seller to increase the seller's proceeds, making buyer's offer more desirable to the seller, at least hopefully. When won't you need Form 41C? You will not need a Form 41C, or said differently, on Form 21, line 17, you'll disclose the amount of compensation sellers offered, and you will mark the box Pay as Offered anytime the seller has offered the amount of compensation that buyer broker is due, anytime the seller has offered more compensation than is owing to buyer broker, but buyer and buyer broker have agreed in advance that any extra offered by the seller will also be payable to the listing firm. And you will mark Pay as Offered, not needing a Form 41C, anytime that the seller has offered less compensation than the buyer broker is due, but the buyer has said, I will bring the difference to closing for your benefit. Buyer broker, do not ask the seller to make up the difference. In those three instances, you're going to mark the Pay as Offered box on Form 21, paragraph 17, and you're not going to need Form 41C. But anytime the seller has offered less compensation than the buyer owes and the buyer wants you to go get it from the seller, you're going to use Form 41C. Mark the other C Addendum, 41C. And anytime the seller has offered more compensation than you're owed, and that extra is either going to go to the buyer or to the seller, then you're going to mark Other C Addendum, and you're going to use Form 41C to negotiate that issue. Buyer brokers and listing brokers, if this is documented incorrectly, and if you place buyer broker compensation into Form 22A, paragraph 3, the buyer closing cost provision, then depending on the type of loan buyer is getting, you may draft a purchase and sale agreement that cannot close because the lender will not approve the settlement statement. Because if you lump buyer broker's compensation into Form 22A, paragraph 3, you are telling escrow that those are considered buyer closing costs and they will land in buyer's column on the settlement statement. And if the buyer is obtaining a loan where they are not allowed to pay the buyer broker compensation, then the funder who reviews that settlement statement will reject that loan, will reject that transaction, and your closing will fail at the closing table. And it will fail because the purchase and sale agreement was drafted improperly. You got to know this stuff. If you have questions on this or anything else, ask me a question by visiting WARealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.